The winter of 1862 had been cruel to Tennessee, but the Cumberland River Valley still carried the faint green promise of spring beneath its frost. On February 16th, federal forces under General Don Carlos Buell completed their occupation of Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall. By the 18th, patrols fanned out into Davidson County, securing farms, mills, and the grand houses of men who had sent their sons and their cotton south to feed the rebellion. The Union Army needed shelter, hospitals, stables, and supply depots. Empty properties were claimed without ceremony. Officers rode up long gravel drives, posted sentries, and began the inventory of whatever the fleeing owners had left behind. 17 miles southeast of the city, along a bend where the river widened into shallow oxbows, stood the Hartwell estate. The three-story brick manor rose above its outbuildings like a sentinel that had forgotten to flee. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No dogs barked at approaching horsemen. The front gates hung open. One hinge rusted loose, but the lawn had been recently mowed, last autumn perhaps, and the rose beds still showed the careful pruning of a gardener who expected to return. Captain William Morrison, 3rd Ohio Infantry, led the detail that drew the short straw. 32 years old, a schoolteacher before the war, he had already seen enough abandoned Southern homes to know the pattern. Drawers pulled out, papers burned in hearths, silver gone, portraits slashed or carried away. He expected disorder. What he found instead was stillness so complete it felt deliberate. The company dismounted in the circular drive. Men spread out, carbines at the ready, boots crunching on the gravel. Morrison pushed open the heavy oak door himself. It swung inward without resistance. The entrance hall smelled of wood smoke long cold and beeswax polish. A grandfather clock stood against the far wall, its face frozen at 3:47. The pendulum hung motionless. Morrison noted it absently. Time had stopped here some months earlier. In the dining room, breakfast waited. 8 place settings remained on the long mahogany table. Plates held the blackened remnants of cornbread and ham. A pitcher of milk had curdled into a yellow skin. Coffee cups sat half full, the liquid evaporated to dark rings. A child's spoon lay on the floor beside a chair pushed back as though someone had risen suddenly and never returned. Morrison walked the length of the table, gloved fingers trailing the chairbacks. No blood, no overturned furniture, no sign of struggle, only absence. "Like they stepped out for a moment and forgot to come back," murmured Sergeant Hale, who had followed him inside. Morrison did not answer. He had seen panic evacuations before, furniture toppled, valuables stuffed into carpet bags, but this was different. This was composure interrupted. The company took possession that afternoon. Morrison established his headquarters in the study on the ground floor. Maps were unrolled across the desk, dispatches written by lamplight. Soldiers claimed the upstairs bedrooms, spreading bedrolls over silk counterpanes. In the kitchen, cooks built fires in the great hearth and set pots to boil. The manor, untouched by looters or fire, became an improbable island of federal order amid the chaos of occupation. For 3 days the routine held. Scouts rode out at dawn to map the river roads. Couriers came and went. Wounded men from a skirmish near Murfreesboro were carried in on litters and laid in the parlor, where surgeons worked beneath crystal chandeliers. Morrison himself spent long hours at the study desk, writing reports, reviewing supply requisitions, trying to impose sense on a countryside still loyal to Richmond. On the morning of February 19th, Private James Ketchum drew foraging duty. 21, farm-raised in Claremont County, Ohio, he had joined up in '61 with dreams of adventure that had long since curdled into routine hunger and cold. His squad was sent to search outbuildings for potatoes, turnips, anything the Harwells might have stored against hard times. The root cellar lay beneath the main house, reached by stone steps behind the kitchen wing. Ketchum descended with 2 others, Privates Dorsey and Hale, no relation to the sergeant, carrying lanterns and empty sacks. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the cellar stretched 40 feet by 30, its stone walls damp and lined with empty shelves. Broken canning jars glittered in the lantern light. Burlap sacks slumped in corners, some split and spilling shriveled apples long past use. Ketchum moved methodically, kicking aside debris, hoping for buried roots or crocks of preserves. Near the northeast corner he paused. He tapped the packed earth floor with his boot heel. The sound came back hollow, a dull thump that echoed strangely. He crouched, brushed away dust and loose straw, and rapped again with his knuckles. Hollow. "Over here," he called. Dorsey and Hale joined him. Together they dragged sacks aside until a square of weathered oak planks appeared, 3 feet on each side. An iron ring handle lay flush in the center, beside a heavy sliding bolt rusted brown, but still serviceable. Ketchum gripped the ring and pulled. The hatch resisted, then gave with a groan of old wood and metal. A draft rose immediately, thick, sour, carrying the unmistakable stench of human waste, unwashed bodies, and decay sealed away for months. All 3 men recoiled. Dorsey turned aside and vomited onto the dirt floor. Ketchum dropped the hatch. It thudded shut, muffling the smell but not erasing it from their nostrils. "Captain," Hale said as he was already moving for the stairs, "you need to see this." Morrison arrived within minutes, coat unbuttoned, still holding the pencil he had been using to mark a map. He listened to Ketchum's stammering report without expression, then ordered fresh lanterns brought down. When the light arrived, he knelt beside the hatch himself, slid the bolt back, and lifted the cover slowly. The smell hit harder this time. Morrison held his breath for a count of 10, then leaned forward. A wooden ladder, simple and sturdy, disappeared into black. He called down once, "Anyone there?" and received only silence. "Private Ketchum, you found it. You go first." Ketchum swallowed, took a lantern, and started down. The ladder creaked under his weight. Morrison, Hale, and Dorsey watched from above, lanterns casting long shadows that danced on the stone walls below. Ketchum reached the bottom. His boots touched packed earth. He lifted the lantern high. The chamber stretched perhaps 20 by 30 feet, ceiling low enough that he had to stoop slightly. Crude sleeping pallets lined the walls, straw-stuffed ticks on wooden frames, some still holding the shallow depressions of bodies. Waste buckets stood in a corner, overflowing. An overturned water barrel leaked its last contents into the dirt. And the far corner, huddled together like animals driven to cover, were the children. 8 of them. They were filthy, skeletal, dressed in rags that might once have been shifts or simple shirts. Their hair hung in matted ropes, skin stretched tight over cheekbones and ribs. Lesions and open sores wept on arms and necks. When the lantern light struck them, they flinched as one, raising thin arms to shield their eyes. Not a sound escaped them. No cry, no question, no plea. They simply shrank from the brightness, pressing closer together, faces blank, eyes reflecting the flame like glass beads. Ketchum stood frozen. For a long moment he could not speak. Then, in a voice that cracked, he called up the ladder. "Captain, there's children down here, 8 of them. They're alive, but barely." Morrison descended without another word. He moved past Ketchum, lantern raised, and stopped 10 feet from the huddled group. The children did not look at him directly. One older girl rocked slowly back and forth, mouth working soundlessly. A boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, scratched at the stone wall with broken fingernails in a slow, endless rhythm. Morrison's face, usually composed, drained of color. He stood there perhaps 2 full minutes, taking in the pallets, the buckets, the utter absence of any comfort or hope. Then he turned and climbed back up the ladder without speaking. When he emerged into the root cellar, his voice was quiet but firm. "Get the surgeon, now." The ladder creaked again as Captain Morrison descended once more, this time with deliberate slowness. He carried no weapon, only a lantern in one hand and an open palm in the other, as though approaching wild creatures that might bolt or bite. Above him, Sergeant Hale and 2 other men held lanterns high, their light pooling around the hatch like hesitant dawn. The stench was worse now that the hatch had been open for several minutes. It rolled up in waves, thick and intimate, the smell of bodies that had forgotten what clean air felt like. Morrison reached the bottom rung, stepped onto the hard-packed earth and crouched. 10 paces away, the 8 children remained frozen in their corner, arms still raised against the light, faces half hidden behind thin forearms and matted hair. He spoke first to Ketchum, who stood rigid beside him. "Stay back. Don't move suddenly. Don't raise your voice." Then, softer, he addressed the children. "My name is William Morrison. I'm a soldier with the United States Army. We're not here to hurt you. We're going to take you out of this place, up into the house. There's food, there's light, there's air." No response, only shallow breathing, rapid and shallow. One girl, the oldest, perhaps 12 or 13, rocked forward and back in a tight mechanical rhythm. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish drowning in air. He tried again. "You don't have to speak. Just look at me if you can. One of you, just one." Minutes passed. Then the smallest child, a girl no older than 7, lowered one arm just enough to peek through the gap. Her eyes, huge in a face that seemed too small, met Morrison's for perhaps 2 seconds before she flinched away again. It was enough. Morrison turned to Ketchum. "Go up. Tell Dr. Hayes we need blankets, water, bread, anything soft, and tell him to come down himself, no one else, no sudden movements." 20 minutes later, Dr. Albert Hayes arrived. He was 41, balding, hands steady from years of field surgery, yet even he paused at the top of the ladder when the smell reached him. He descended without comment, medical satchel slung over his shoulder. When he saw the children, his jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm, almost gentle. "I'm a doctor," he said. "My name is Albert. I want to look at you. I want to see if you're hurt. Will you let me come closer?" He waited. No one moved. He took one slow step, then another. The rocking girl stopped moving, her head tilted slightly, listening. Hayes kept talking, low, steady, the way one speaks to a horse that has been beaten too many times. He explained every movement before he made it. "I'm opening my bag now. This is just a cloth. This is clean water. This is a piece of bread. See? I'm going to set them here on the floor, between us." He placed the items down, then retreated several steps. For nearly an hour the coaxing continued. One child at a time they crept forward, first the smallest girl, then a boy whose right arm hung at an unnatural angle, then 2 more who moved only when the others had already taken a few steps. The older ones came last, shepherding the younger like exhausted sentinels. When the last child finally stood beneath the hatch opening, pale faces blinking up into the light from above, Morrison had to turn away for a moment. He wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and cleared his throat. "Bring them up one at a time, slowly. Help them if they'll let you." The soldiers formed a human ladder, 2 below, 2 above, passing each child gently from hand to hand. Some whimpered at the touch, some went limp as though their bodies had forgotten how to resist. None fought. They were too weak or perhaps too conditioned to resist. By the time the last child was carried into the manor's wide parlor, the sun had dropped behind the river oaks, and the room was lit by oil lamps and a fresh fire in the hearth. Blankets were spread on the carpet. A table had been pushed aside. The 8 children were laid in a row like casualties after a battle. Dr. Hayes began his examinations without preamble. He worked in silence at first, only the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft gasp from one of the children breaking the stillness. He measured pulses with 2 fingers. He lifted arms and legs, noting the way bones pressed against skin. He opened mouths and winced at blackened gums and missing teeth. He pressed abdomens, listened to chests with a stethoscope, and shook his head at the wet rattle in several lungs. The findings came in fragments, spoken half to himself, half to the orderly who stood ready with paper and pencil.
severe malnutrition, weights perhaps 40 to 60% below normal for age, visible rickets, look at the bowing of the legs on the two youngest, ribs like washboards, bellies distended from edema, not fullness. He moved to the skin. Multiple sores, fungal infections, impetigo, untreated abrasions. This one has a fracture in the forearm that healed crooked, months old, maybe years. Another has scars across the back, consistent with whipping, but old and faint. He tested reflexes. Most responded sluggishly. 2 did not respond at all. Catatonia in at least 2, mutism in 4, possibly elective, possibly organic. They flinch at sudden noise, they avoid eye contact, they shrink from any raised hand even to adjust a blanket. One boy, perhaps 9, began to scratch at his own arm in the same repetitive motion Ketchum had seen underground. Hayes gently caught the wrist and held it still. The boy did not pull away. He simply stared at the ceiling, unblinking. Hayes straightened after nearly 2 hours. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue, but from something deeper. I've seen children pulled from burning houses. I've seen them after raids. I have never seen this. This is not neglect. This was deliberate design. Morrison nodded toward the open hatch, still visible through the open cellar door. There's more down there. Chambers, things we haven't fully mapped yet. Hayes wiped his hands on a cloth. Then we go back. They returned with 4 lanterns and 2 armed men. The main chamber was as Ketchum had described, crude pallets, waste buckets, the overturned barrel, but 3 narrow passages led away from it. The first passage opened into a smaller room, 15 by 20 feet, containing 12 sleeping pallets arranged in 2 precise rows. Straw mattresses still held the impressions of bodies. A few rags lay folded at the foot of each pallet, as though someone had tried to impose order on misery. The second passage led to what must have been the sanitation area, a row of wooden buckets, a crude drain hole bored into the stone, a single barrel that had once held water. The smell here was strongest, almost visible. The third passage was the narrowest. It ended in a room barely 8 feet in square. Inside stood a single wooden chair facing the wall. Above the chair, at eye level, 3 horizontal slits had been cut through the stone, narrow observation ports that looked directly into the main chamber. On a small desk beside the chair lay a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from handling. Hayes opened it with careful fingers. The first page was dated February 12, 1956. Controlled Development Protocol, Day 1. Subjects introduced to environment at 07:15. Initial resistance noted in subjects 4, 7, and 12. Hatch secured at 0940. Observation commenced. Hayes turned the page, then another. The handwriting was meticulous, almost beautiful, columns of observations, measurements, notes on behavior modification. He stopped breathing for a moment when he reached the later entries. Day 137. Subject 7 expired at approximately 0630. Cause presumed pulmonary infection, secondary to environmental conditions. Body removed at 10:15 to minimize distress response in remaining subjects. Day 208. Subject 9 succumbed to septicemia following traumatic injury. Protocol adjustment recommended. Improved wound management materials to be considered. Hayes closed the journal slowly. He looked back toward the main chamber, where 2 pallets still held small shrouded forms, 2 still, 2 small. 2 more children. Decomposition had advanced, but not so far that the features were unrecognizable. Thin arms, hollow cheeks, eyes sunken and clouded. Hayes knelt beside one of the bodies, lifted the thin blanket, and immediately replaced it. He stood, face gray. "Captain," he said, "this was not an accident. This was not a crime of passion. This was a system, a deliberate, documented system." Morrison stared at the journal in Hayes's hand. Outside, in the parlor, the 8 living children lay wrapped in blankets, staring at the ceiling with eyes that had forgotten to hope. And somewhere in the house, a grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:47 began to tick once, then stopped again, as though even time could not bear to continue.
Chapter 3. Edmund Harwell, Early Life and Formation. Edmund Harwell was born on a sweltering August morning in 1814 in a narrow brick house on Meeting Street in Charleston, South Carolina. The city hummed with the clatter of carriages and the cries of street vendors, but inside the Harwell home, silence was law. Marcus Harwell, his father, was a schoolmaster who ran a small academy for the sons of merchants and minor planters. He believed affection was a distraction from the mind's true work. Praise came in measured doses. Disappointment arrived like a storm cloud, dark and wordless. Edmund's mother, Sarah, died when he was 6. One morning she simply wasn't there. Marcus removed every trace of her dresses, her books of poetry, the small porcelain figurines she had collected, burned them in the backyard brazier while Edmund watched from an upstairs window. "Sentiment is weakness," Marcus told him that evening, voice flat as slate. "We manage loss by refusing to feel it." From that day forward, the house felt larger and colder, as though part of its warmth had been carried away with the smoke. By 8, he could recite passages from Cicero and Xenophon. By 10, he solved geometry problems that stumped older boys. Marcus drilled him relentlessly: Latin at dawn, mathematics at noon, natural philosophy after supper. Failure brought no lash, it brought silence. The boy learned to dread that quiet more than any blow. He became precise, methodical, a machine of intellect wrapped in a child's skin. At 15, Marcus discovered the notebooks. Edmund had been trapping stray cats and dogs in the alley behind the academy, not to harm them outright, but to study them. He recorded how a length of twine tied to a tail could condition a cat to leap at the sound of a bell, how withholding food for a day sharpened a dog's obedience to a whistle. The entries were meticulous: dates, times, stimuli, responses. No cruelty for its own sake, only curiosity about control. Marcus did not strike him. Instead, he sat beside his son at the kitchen table and read the pages slowly. When he finished, he said, "The work is sound, but you must learn discretion. Men fear what they do not understand. Hide the hand that moves the strings." It was the closest thing to approval Edmund ever received. From that moment he understood, knowledge was power, but power required secrecy. In 1831, at 17, he entered East Tennessee University, then little more than a cluster of brick buildings in Knoxville, studying agricultural science. The South was awakening to agricultural farming, crop rotation, soil chemistry, selective breeding. Edmund devoured it all. While classmates dreamed of bountiful harvests, he saw systems to be mastered. Living things, plants, animals, perhaps even people, were inputs waiting to be optimized. His senior thesis, submitted in 1836, was titled "Environmental Determinism in Agricultural Production: Eliminating Variable Factors to Maximize Yield Optimization." 22 pages of elegant prose and ruthless logic. He argued that chaos, weather, pests, human error could be tamed through absolute control of conditions. One professor called it brilliant, another, privately, called it chilling. "He reduces life to levers and pulleys," the man whispered to a colleague. "No room left for mercy." Edmund graduated with highest honors and few friends. He had no taste for drink, cards, or courtship. His passion was efficiency, and efficiency required resources he did not yet possess. In the spring of 1841, at a Knoxville assembly for tobacco merchants, he met Louisa Kenton. She was 20, pale, musical, the only daughter of a failing planter whose 600-acre Davidson County estate lay mortgaged and neglected.
Edmund courted her with the same precision he applied to everything else, calculated walks in the garden, measured compliments on her pianoforte playing, quiet assurances that he could restore her father's land to profitability. There was no fire in his eyes, only steady intent. Louisa, sheltered and hopeful, mistook steadiness for depth. They married in March 1842. Her father, desperate and dying, transferred the deed as part of the dowry: land, house, outbuildings, and 43 enslaved people. Edmund was 28. For the first time, he owned something vast enough to test his theories on a human scale. He walked the fields that first evening alone, ledger in hand, already calculating yields, labor hours, soil composition. The manor rose behind him, quiet and waiting. Somewhere beneath its foundations, a darker idea had already taken root.
Edmund Harwell stepped onto the broad porch of the Davidson County Manor for the first time as its master in the spring of 1842, ledger already open in his hand. The fields stretched before him in exhausted rows, cotton stalks brittle from years of single-crop planting, soil leached gray, fences sagging like tired shoulders. The 43 enslaved people who worked the land moved slowly, eyes down, bodies marked by the previous owner's neglect, thin frames, poorly healed scars, children barefoot and underfed. Most planters would have seen ruin. Edmund saw raw material. He began at dawn the next morning. No grand speeches, no threats. He simply walked the quarters with a notebook, observing, measuring, recording. Height, weight, estimated age, visible injuries, strength of grip, speed of gait, willingness to meet his eyes. He interviewed each person, not with kindness, but with clinical questions delivered in a calm, even tone. How many pounds of cotton can you pick in an hour under full sun? What tasks cause you pain? Which overseer did you respond to best? Answers were noted without comment. Within weeks, he had created individual files, 43 slim folders stored in a locked cabinet in the study. He divided the workforce into specialized units: field hands subdivided by crop, skilled artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, domestics, animal handlers. Assignments matched documented capabilities. No more random labor gangs. Every task was calculated for maximum output with minimum waste. Then came the innovation that set him apart. Edmund introduced what he privately called performance-based resource allocation. Workers who exceeded daily quotas received slightly more cornmeal, an extra hour of rest on Sunday, a half-pound of bacon once a month. Those who fell short saw rations trimmed, not to starvation, but enough to feel the difference. It was reward conditioning, borrowed from his boyhood notebooks on stray animals. Punishment remained swift for defiance, but the carrot proved more efficient than the stick. The results astonished even Edmund. By 1844, cotton yields rose 40%. Corn and tobacco followed. Equipment lasted longer under scheduled maintenance. Discipline problems dropped. The quarters grew quieter, more orderly. Neighbors noticed. Invitations arrived to speak at agricultural societies in Nashville and Murfreesboro. Articles appeared under his name in farming journals, rational incentives in labor management. Planters rode out to Willow Bend, now rechristened Harwell Fields, to walk the rows and ask questions. Edmund answered politely, never revealing the full extent of his ledgers or the cold precision behind every decision. Louisa managed the house with quiet competence: dinners for visitors, correspondence with family. The role of plantation mistress played flawlessly, if without joy. Their marriage remained functional: bedrooms separate, conversations confined to crop reports and social obligations. She sensed his distance, the way his eyes lit only when discussing yields or soil pH, but she accepted it. Marriage, in her world, was alliance, not passion.
Yet beneath the success, Edmund's mind turned inward. The adults responded to incentives, yes, but they arrived already formed, habits hardened, loyalties divided. What if the shaping began earlier? What if children could be molded from the start, free of the chaos of family bonds and random experience? In the evenings, after the house grew still, he sat in his study and watched the children playing in the yard below, small figures darting between cabins, laughing, fighting, learning by imitation. Wasted potential, he thought, random variables corrupting the system. By 1848, 19 children under 12 lived on the property. He began observing them more closely during work hours, noting aptitudes, temperaments, responses to authority. The idea took root slowly, like a seed in poor soil, a controlled environment for juvenile development. Not mere schooling, but engineering, total control from the earliest years. He closed his ledger one night in early 1849 and wrote a single line at the bottom of a fresh page. Juvenile Protocol, Phase 1, Separation and Conditioning. The fields outside lay quiet under moonlight. Above ground, Harwell Fields prospered. Below the surface of Edmund's mind, something colder was beginning to grow.
In May 1849, Edmund summoned the enslaved parents to the yard behind the quarters. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the dust. He stood on the porch steps, ledger tucked under his arm, voice clear and unhurried. "Your children over the age of 6, he announced, will now reside in the new dormitory for specialized training. This is for their benefit and the plantation's future. They will learn literacy, arithmetic, and skilled trades. They will return to you when their education is complete." A murmur rose, soft, then sharper. Mothers stepped forward, hands outstretched. One woman, tall and thin, cried out, "Please, sir, not my Josiah. He's only 7. Edmund met her eyes without blinking. "It is decided," he said. "Gather their belongings. They move tonight." No one dared refuse. Legal title rested with him. Resistance meant the lash or worse. 17 children, some weeping, some silent, were led across the fields to a converted storage building near the smokehouse. Inside, rows of narrow cots stood against whitewashed walls. A single window, high and barred, let in thin light. Edmund had installed shelves of basic books, slates, chalk, and a large clock whose ticking filled the space like a heartbeat. He hired William Crane, a young tutor from Knoxville, through intermediaries. Crane needed money and asked few questions. Teaching enslaved children basic skills was unusual, but not illegal. Edmund met him once, handed him a schedule, and explained the rules. Rigid hours, no unsupervised play, daily reports on progress and behavior. The routine began at dawn. Wake at the bell, morning exercises, jumping jacks, running in place, breakfast of cornmeal mush, 2 hours of reading and ciphering from approved texts that emphasized duty and obedience. Afternoon, practical training, sewing, carpentry basics, animal care scaled to small hands. Evening meal, then socialization period, supervised group activities where Edmund observed from the doorway, notebook in hand. He documented everything. How Subject A, a 9-year-old boy, responded faster to verbal praise than to extra food. How Subject F, a 7-year-old girl, withdrew when separated from her brother. Which combinations of children produced calm cooperation and which sparked conflict. He tested variables, one week with stricter silence rules, another with small rewards for perfect posture during lessons. He noted hierarchies forming, the stronger children protecting the weaker, alliances shifting like sand. To outsiders, it appeared enlightened, a planter investing in his workforce's future. Neighbors praised his progressive approach. One even asked for advice on starting a similar program. But Edmund saw only data. The children were not being educated, they were being conditioned. Family stories whispered at night were replaced with memorized passages about accepting one's station. Laughter grew rarer. Questions about home went unanswered. By 1852, Edmund had refined his theory. Human plasticity peaked in childhood. Traditional rearing introduced too many uncontrolled factors: parental affection, peer rebellion, chance encounters. Optimal results required environmental purity, total isolation, no random influences. He began sketching plans late at night: underground chambers, ventilation shafts, observation slits, a space where development could be engineered without interference. In the dormitory, the children slept in rows, breathing in rhythm with the clock's tick. Above them, in the manor study, Edmund turned another page in his private journal and wrote, Phase 2, Absolute Control. Construction to commence spring 1853. The fields outside continued to yield. The children inside continued to change. In the spring of 1853, Edmund Hartwell began what he described in his private ledger as the final phase of environmental purification. He needed a space untouched by the chaos of the surface world, no voices drifting from the quarters, no sunlight to disrupt circadian rhythms, no chance encounters to corrupt conditioning. The answer lay beneath the earth. He summoned a mason from Murfreesboro named Josiah Tate, a taciturn man who had dug cellars and foundations for half the planters in Middle Tennessee. Edmund met him at the smokehouse, far from the main house, and explained the job in clipped sentences: an expansion of the existing root cellar for advanced cold storage. Tate would excavate deeper into the limestone bedrock, reinforce walls, install ventilation, and ask no unnecessary questions. Payment would be generous and in cash. Tate nodded once and began the next week. Work proceeded in secrecy. Edmund rotated enslaved laborers in small shifts, never more than 4 men at a time, so no single group saw the full design. They hauled rock by lantern light, mixed mortar by feel, and carried debris away in wheelbarrows covered with canvas. The entrance remained disguised, a false floor of packed earth and burlap sacks in the northeast corner of the root cellar. Beneath it, a 3-by-3-foot oak hatch with an iron ring and sliding bolt. The chambers took shape over 7 months. The main living space measured 20 by 30 feet, ceiling just 8 feet high, low enough to discourage standing tall, high enough to prevent constant crouching. Stone walls were smoothed and sealed against damp. Tate installed narrow ventilation shafts angled upward through the bedrock, emerging 50 yards away in a thicket of scrub oak where no one would notice the faint iron grates half buried in leaves. Air moved sluggishly but steadily, no drafts, no echoes. Adjoining passages, low, narrow tunnels, led to 3 smaller rooms. The sleeping chamber held 12 wooden pallets in precise rows, each frame bolted to the floor. Straw mattresses were thin, blankets thinner still. The sanitation room featured wooden buckets, a hand-pump drain into a natural crevice below, and a single barrel for washing. The observation station was the smallest, 8 feet square, accessible only from the root cellar via a separate ladder. 3 horizontal slits pierced the wall at seated eye level, allowing perfect view of the main chamber without being seen. A speaking tube, tin pipe sealed with wax, ran from the station to the main room, carrying voice clearly but distorting it just enough to feel disembodied. Edmund supervised every detail. He tested the pulley system himself, a rope and basket rig descending from the root cellar to deliver food and water without entry. He mounted oil lamps on chains with pull ropes routed upward through concealed channels, so light could be raised or extinguished from above. On the shelves he placed carefully chosen books, religious tracts extolling submission, simple arithmetic primers, moral tales of obedience rewarded, nothing that might spark curiosity or rebellion. By December 1853, the work was finished. Tate was paid and sent away with instructions never to speak of the job. The laborers who had dug returned to field work,
none the wiser about the purpose of what they had built. Edmund descended alone on the final night, lantern in hand. He walked the main chamber, ran his fingers along the cool stone, tested the speaking tube with a single whispered word, "Order," and listened to it echo faintly. Satisfied, he climbed back up, secured the hatch, and covered it again with sacks. The chambers waited empty, silent, perfect. For 2 years they remained so. Edmund continued his surface routines, ledgers, crop rotations, neighborly dinners, but in the quiet hours after midnight he would sometimes descend to the root cellar, lift the hatch just enough to feel the cool draft rise and listen to the absolute stillness below. He was waiting, not for inspiration, but for the precise moment when philosophy became action, when the final variable, human attachment, could be eliminated entirely. In March 1855, that moment arrived.
On the evening of March 8, 1855, the manor house filled with the low, urgent sounds of labor. Louisa Hartwell, 34 and pregnant for the first time, had been unwell for months. Swollen ankles, persistent fatigue, a pallor that no amount of rest could erase. Dr. Nathan Pierce, summoned from Nashville, arrived just after dusk with his black medical bag and a calm that masked growing concern. The bedroom curtains were drawn against the night. Candles burned low on the dresser. Labor stretched through the dark hours. By dawn it was clear the child lay wrong, breech perhaps, or twisted. Pierce tried forceps, his hands steady but his face tight with effort. At 11:40 a.m. on March 9, a boy was delivered stillborn, blue and silent. Louisa hemorrhaged moments later. She bled through every towel and compress the doctor pressed to her. 2 hours after the child's birth, she slipped away, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though searching for something just out of reach. Edmund stood in the doorway through it all. He did not weep, he did not pace. When Pierce rose from the bedside, wiping blood from his hands, Edmund asked only one question. Was there anything preventable? The doctor hesitated, then shook his head. Not with what we know now. Medicine has limits. Edmund nodded once, as though filing the answer away for later. The funeral was small. Neighbors came with casseroles and murmured condolences. The minister spoke of God's mysterious will. Edmund thanked each guest in measured tones, voice level, posture erect. Dr. Pierce lingered longest, watching the widower accept a handshake without tremor. "You're bearing this with remarkable composure," the doctor said quietly. Edmund met his eyes. "Grief is inefficient," he replied. "It changes nothing." Pierce left unsettled, telling his wife later that Edmund Hartwell had looked less like a grieving husband than a man calculating the cost of a failed experiment. In the days that followed, Edmund withdrew to his study. The house grew quieter still. Servants moved on tiptoe, afraid to disturb the silence. He did not open Louisa's room. He did not look at her portrait on the landing. Instead, he sat at his desk with journals spread before him, pen moving in steady strokes. His entries from those weeks marked a subtle but profound shift. Where once he had written of crops and labor yields, now he turned to broader questions. March 24, 1855. Nature remains chaotic. Birth and death occur without design, wasteful and random. Human intelligence exists to impose order. The farmer who permits wild growth is a fool. The parent who permits random development is likewise foolish. We need not accept what chance delivers when we can engineer better outcomes. He reread old correspondence with phrenologists and early psychologists, men who measured skulls and claimed character could be predicted or reshaped. He ordered new books on sensory deprivation and isolation. He sketched diagrams of controlled environments, sealed rooms, timed light cycles, voices delivered without visible source. Louisa's death had not broken him. It had liberated him. She had been a functional part of his system, household manager, social buffer, bearer of potential heirs. That part had failed. The failure did not wound him, it clarified. Sentiment was the last variable he had tolerated. Now it was gone. By autumn 1855, the idea that had simmered for years crystallized into certainty. Optimal human development required absolute environmental purity. Childhood was the window of maximum plasticity. Traditional rearing, family affection, peer influence, uncontrolled experience introduced noise that distorted results. What was needed was isolation, total, scientific, hidden. He returned to the root cellar one November night, lantern in hand. He lifted the false floor, opened the hatch, and descended into the empty chambers. The stone walls were cold and perfect. The observation slits waited like dark eyes. The speaking tube hung silent. Edmund stood in the center of the main room and spoke aloud for the first time since construction. Subjects will enter soon. His voice echoed softly off the stone, then died. Above ground, the plantation continued its orderly rhythm. Below, the chambers waited, patient, absolute, ready.
The morning of February 12, 1856, dawned cold and clear over Harwell Fields. Edmund rose before first light, dressed in his usual black coat, and walked to the children's dormitory without haste. William Crane was already inside, lighting the stove. Edmund spoke quietly. "I am transferring 12 students to the advanced facility today. You will continue with the others as before." Crane nodded, eyes on the floor. He had learned long ago that questions earned nothing but silence. Edmund entered the dormitory. The 17 children still asleep stirred at the sound of his boots. He selected the 12 he had chosen months earlier, those with the fewest ties, the quietest temperaments, the cleanest files in his ledger. "Gather your things," he said. "You are moving to new quarters for specialized training. Bring only what you need for study and rest." The children obeyed. Some looked puzzled, others hopeful. New quarters might mean better food, warmer blankets. A few glanced toward the door as though expecting parents to appear and object. None did. Edmund led them in a single file across the frost-crusted yard, past the smokehouse, to the root cellar entrance. The air grew colder as they descended the stone steps. Lanterns hung from hooks, their light caught on empty shelves and burlap sacks. In the northeast corner, Edmund pulled the sacks aside. The oak hatch lay exposed. He slid the bolt with a metallic scrape and lifted the cover. A draft rose, carrying the faint, clean smell of new stone. "Your new quarters are below," he said. "Climb down carefully." The oldest boy, Marcus, aged 10, hesitated at the edge. Edmund's voice hardened just enough. "You will obey immediately, or you will be punished. Descend now." Marcus gripped the ladder and went first. One by one the others followed, some crying softly, some silent, all small shadows vanishing into the dark. Edmund descended last, lantern in hand. For the next 2 hours he conducted the orientation with mechanical precision. He showed them the main chamber, the 12 pallets arranged in rows, each marked with a number chalked on the frame. The sanitation room with its buckets and drain, the pulley basket hanging from the ceiling, the shelves of books, moral lessons, obedience primers, simple sums. He demonstrated the lamps on chains, pulling the rope to raise and lower the light. He spoke through the tin tube once, his voice emerging distorted and omnipotent from the wall. "This is how I will speak to you." Then the rules, delivered without inflection. Wake when called. Follow the schedule. Maintain cleanliness. Obey instructions immediately. Cooperate. Fighting will be punished. Never touch the ladder. Never attempt the hatch. Never make excessive noise. Some children wept openly now. Edmund ignored the tears as though they were irrelevant data. When he finished, he climbed the ladder. 12 faces looked up from below, pale in the lantern glow, eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Your first meal will be delivered this evening," he said. "Use this time to settle. Review the reading materials. I will speak again tomorrow morning."
He closed the hatch. The bolt slid home with finality. The sound echoed down the shaft, then faded. Edmund returned to the manor, entered his study, and opened a fresh journal. He dipped his pen. February 12, 1856. Controlled Development Protocol, Day 1. Subjects introduced at 7:15. Initial resistance. Subjects 4, 7, 12 exhibited vocal distress. Hatch secured at 9:40. Baseline behavioral metrics recorded. Observation commences. He closed the book and sat in silence, listening to the house settle around him. Below ground, the lamps had been extinguished from above. Absolute darkness swallowed the chamber. 12 children huddled together on the pallets, hands finding hands in the black. No one spoke for a long time. Then a small voice, Ada, 6 years old, whispered, "When do we go home?" No one answered. The darkness held the question unanswered until morning. The first weeks underground settled into a rhythm as merciless as a metronome. Edmund controlled every element from above. Light arrived when he chose, dimmed when he willed it. Food descended in the pulley basket at precise intervals. Cornmeal mush at morning, beans and cornbread at midday, a thin porridge at evening. Portions were measured to sustain life, never to satisfy. Water came in tin cups lowered one at a time. Waste buckets were raised and emptied on a schedule only he understood. Through the speaking tube, his voice emerged without warning, disembodied, calm, omnipresent. "Morning begins," it would say, and the chain lamps would rise, flooding the chamber with yellow glare that made the children flinch and shield their eyes. "Begin reading. Moral Lessons for Youth, page 12. The oldest, Marcus, would open the book with trembling hands and read aloud in a monotone. "The virtuous child accepts his place without complaint." The others listened, some mouthing the words silently, some staring at the stone floor. Physical exercise followed, jumping in place, stretching arms overhead, running circuits around the perimeter of the chamber until breath came in gasps. Edmund watched through the observation slits, pocket watch in hand, noting who tired first, who maintained form longest. These were not for health, they were data points. Afternoon brought skills training. Baskets descended with wooden blocks, scraps of cloth, small tools. Tasks were simple but timed. Sort the blocks by color, fold the cloth into perfect squares, recite multiplication tables while balancing on one foot. Rewards were rare, a few extra minutes of light, a spoonful more molasses. Punishments were collective. One child's refusal meant reduced rations for all. Edmund called it group dynamics leverage. Within days, the children learned to pressure the resistant one themselves. Joseph, 8, refused food on the 3rd day. By the 5th, the others begged him to eat so their own portions would return. He complied. Edmund noted, successful application of peer enforcement, resistance extinguished in 96 hours. In darkness, when lamps were extinguished and the chamber plunged into black, the children found fragile ways to endure. They pressed palms together in a circle, breathing in unison to mark time. They whispered stories remembered from above, Bible tales, folk songs half forgotten, anything to fill the void. Marcus emerged as leader, calming the youngest, enforcing Edmund's rules to prevent worse punishments. Ada clung to Sarah, the 9-year-old girl who sang lullabies in the dark until voices cracked. But the toll mounted. By late spring, skin paled to translucency, hair thinned, eyes grew huge in shrinking faces. Coughs echoed off the walls. Edmund documented it all with clinical detachment. Day 47, competitive ration distribution introduced, hierarchy solidifying as predicted, social cohesion fracturing under resource stress. One evening in early June, Thomas, 7, quiet, began coughing wetly. Fever rose overnight. The children tried to care for him, extra water from their own cups, hands on his forehead. They called up the tube. "Please, sir, Thomas is sick." Edmund lowered willow bark tea and a tonic of his own making. He did not descend. He observed. Thomas died on June 18th at dawn. Benjamin held his hand until the breathing stopped. When the hatch opened for morning protocol, Benjamin called up, "Thomas is dead, sir. He stopped breathing." Edmund's response came through the tube, flat and precise. "Noted. Body will be removed this evening." That night he descended for the first time since day one. He carried Thomas up the ladder while 11 children watched in silence. No words of comfort, no acknowledgement. The hatch closed. The boy vanished. Underground, hope fractured. Above, Edmund wrote, "Subject 7 expired. Unfortunate variable. Protocol continues." The routine resumed the next morning, unbroken. The months after Thomas's death stretched into a grinding sameness that eroded everything human. Edmund withdrew further from direct engagement. The speaking tube carried fewer instructions. The lamps rose and fell on mechanical schedule rather than deliberate variation. Baskets descended with the same minimal rations: cornmeal, beans, occasional salt pork, but never enough to quiet the hollow ache in small bellies. He documented less, pages once dense with observations now sparse. Day 312, subjects compliant, no incidents. Day 378, rations adjusted downward, adaptation observed. Physical decline crept in slowly, then accelerated. Skin turned waxy and pale, almost luminous in the lamplight. Bones pushed sharper against flesh, legs bowed under the weight of rickets. Hair thinned to wisps, teeth loosened in swollen gums. Coughs became chronic, wet and rattling. Infections bloomed in the damp, open sores that wept yellow, fungal patches spreading across scalps and between toes. Ruth, 8, fell from the storage shelves in September 1856 while reaching for a dropped cloth square. The gash on her leg bled freely at first. The children pressed rags to it, called up the tube for help. Edmund lowered bandages and a bottle of alcohol. In the perpetual damp, with no clean water to wash, infection took hold within days. Fever rose. Delirium followed. She died on September 4, whispering names no one recognized. Edmund descended that night, carried her body up the ladder past the silent, staring children. Subject 9 expired. Septicemia secondary to traumatic injury, he wrote. Environment presents ongoing health risks. Duration reduction under consideration. The entry trailed off. He never acted on it. The 10 remaining children adapted in ways that frightened even themselves. They moved less, spoke less. Marcus still tried to lead, dividing food evenly, enforcing quiet during evening, but his voice grew thin. Sarah rocked Ada for hours when the darkness pressed too close. Benjamin scratched patterns into the stone with a broken nail hour after hour, as though mapping an escape that existed only in his mind. Obsessive rituals took root, counting breaths, arranging pebbles in precise lines, washing hands in the scant water until skin cracked and bled. Above ground, Edmund unraveled quietly. His journals grew erratic, skipped days, then frantic scrawls justifying every death as methodological variable. He drank more, the decanter in his study emptying faster. Neighbors noticed his gaunt face, his absence from agricultural meetings. Some whispered that grief over Louisa had finally caught him. Others said he had always been strange. Now he was simply fading. The enslaved workers in the quarters suspected. Children had vanished. Faint sounds sometimes carried on still nights through the ventilation shafts. Soft cries, a child's cough. But who could speak? Accusing the master meant the whip, sail, or worse. They watched the manor house grow darker. Shutters closed earlier each evening and remained silent. By 1859, Edmund had but abandoned the experiment in spirit.
He maintained the pulley deliveries, the light cycles, the waste removal, but he no longer descended, no longer watched through the slits. The chambers had become a problem he could not solve. Release invited exposure. Sale invited questions. Death required action he still recoiled from naming, so he did nothing. Underground, the 10 children existed in a gray limbo between survival and surrender. They had learned obedience so thoroughly that freedom, if it ever came, would terrify them. They waited, breathing in rhythm, palms pressed together in the dark, for a morning that might never arrive.
The decade that began in quiet routine ended in the roar of secession. South Carolina left the Union in December 1860. Tennessee followed in June 1861 after Fort Sumter. Hartwell Fields lay far from the first battlefields, but the war crept closer with every rumor carried by passing riders. Edmund read the newspapers in his study, maps spread beside empty decanters, and understood what few others yet grasped. The Federal Army would come north from Kentucky, and Nashville would fall. When it did, his property, 17 miles southeast, would be requisitioned, searched, occupied. By autumn 1861, the signs were unmistakable. Distant cannon fire sometimes carried on the wind. Confederate recruiters rode through the county, taking young men and horses. Edmund, a known sympathizer, began preparations to flee south. He sold livestock quietly, packed silver and ledgers into trunks, arranged passage through intermediaries to Confederate-held territory. The manor house grew emptier, rooms shuttered, servants dismissed or reassigned to distant fields. The 10 children below remained the one insoluble problem. He could not transport them. Their condition would draw questions no explanation could answer. Release was unthinkable. They would speak, however brokenly, and rumors would spread like fire through dry grass. To leave them with supplies and hope for the best felt like cowardice. To end them directly felt like admitting what he had become. He wrestled with the decision in silence, journals now filled with half-sentences and crossed-out lines. On November 15, 1861, he made his choice, or deferred it. He descended to the root cellar at midnight, lantern low. He lowered basket after basket through the pulley, extra sacks of cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, water barrels enough for months if rationed carefully. The children stirred at the unfamiliar sounds. A few called up weakly through the tube, voices thin and cracked. Edmund did not answer. He tested the ventilation shafts one last time, secured the hatch bolt with a final scrape of iron on iron, and climbed the stairs without looking back. His last journal entry, written by candlelight in the study, read, "The subjects below represent a complication that cannot accompany relocation. The most practical solution requires decisive action that I find myself unable to—" The sentence broke off. The rest of the page remained blank. He departed 2 days later on horseback before dawn, a single trunk strapped behind the saddle. No farewell to the remaining workers, no instructions beyond vague orders to maintain the fields until further notice. The manor house stood empty, shutters closed, gates ajar. Smoke no longer rose from the chimneys. Underground, the children waited. At first, they believed the extra food meant something had changed, perhaps release, perhaps a new overseer. They rationed carefully, sharing every crumb, pressing palms in their circle when the lamps went out. Days blurred, weeks passed. The pulley remained still. Lamps rose and fell on their own diminishing oil reserves until the wicks guttered and died for good. Darkness became absolute. Supplies dwindled. Hunger sharpened into a constant gnawing presence. Coughs worsened. Fevers returned. 2 more slipped away in the endless night, one from starvation, one from a pneumonia that rattled through the stone like distant thunder. The 8 survivors huddled closer, bodies weaker, minds retreating into the small rituals that had kept them sane, breathing in rhythm, tracing invisible patterns on each other's palms, whispering names of the lost as though to keep them present. Above, winter closed in. Snow dusted the fields.
Union scouts appeared on the river roads. The manor waited, silent and untouched, breakfast plates still on the table, grandfather clock frozen at 3:47. And beneath it all, 8 children endured in darkness so complete that even memory began to fade.
The darkness that followed Edmund's departure was different, deeper, final. No more voice from the tube, no more baskets descending on their rope. The last lamps had flickered out weeks earlier, oils spent, wicks charred to nothing. Absolute black pressed against eyes that had long forgotten color. Time dissolved, there were only breaths, heartbeats, the slow drip of condensation from the stone ceiling. The children rationed what Edmund had left with desperate care. Cornmeal was pinched into tiny handfuls, beans counted one by one, water sipped from cupped palms until barrels rang hollow. Hunger became a constant companion, sharp at first, then dull and heavy, settling into bones. Fevers returned in the damp cold. 2 more slipped away in the endless night. First came little Levi, 9 years old, who had grown so quiet in the last months that his absence was felt before it was noticed. One morning, a moment they marked only by the rhythm of their shared breathing, he stopped responding. His chest no longer rose. The others pressed close, whispered his name, waited for the miracle that never came. They covered him with the thinnest blanket, arranged his hands across his chest as they had seen adults do long ago, and waited for the body to be taken as the others had been. No one came. After days, perhaps a week, the smell grew unbearable. They moved him to the farthest corner of the sanitation room, covered him with straw from a torn pallet, and tried not to breathe too deeply near that end of the chamber. Then Sarah weakened. The girl who had sung lullabies and held Ada through every terror developed a rattling cough that echoed off the walls. She refused most of her share, pressing crumbs into Ada's mouth instead. One night she whispered, "Tell them I tried," though no one knew who them might be. She died curled against the wall, hand still outstretched toward the younger ones. 8 remained. They survived on what moisture they could lick from the stone, on memory, on the small circle of palms pressed together when despair threatened to swallow them whole. They no longer spoke of rescue. The word had lost meaning. They existed in fragments, counting heartbeats to mark days, tracing invisible shapes on each other's arms, breathing in unison to prove they were still alive. On February 19, 1862, the hatch opened without warning. Light, harsh, blinding, flooded down the shaft like a physical blow. Private James Ketchum's lantern swung as he descended, followed by Captain Morrison and 2 others. The children flinched as one, arms raised, bodies curling inward. No cries, no questions, only the instinctive shrinking from brightness that had become pain. Ketchum froze at the bottom rung. "Captain," his voice cracked, "they're here. 8 of them." Morrison descended slowly, lantern raised. He saw the pallets, the waste buckets, the huddled forms, skeletal, filthy, eyes reflecting flame like animals cornered in a cave. One girl rocked silently. A boy scratched at the wall in slow, endless circles. Morrison's breath caught. He knelt, voice low. "We're here to take you out. You're safe now." The children did not move at first. Freedom was as incomprehensible as the light. It took nearly 3 hours, gentle coaxing, blankets lowered, hands offered without sudden motion, to bring them up one by one. Some had to be carried, legs too weak to climb. They flinched at every touch, every voice, every glimpse of open sky through the manor windows. In the parlor, Dr. Hayes waited. As the last child was laid on a blanket, he began his examination, hands steady but face ashen. The room filled with the quiet sounds of horror, measured breaths, soft exclamations, the scratch of pencil on paper as he recorded what no medical text had prepared him for.
8 children entered darkness in 1856. 8 emerged, broken, stunted, alive, into a world at war, a world that would soon decide their suffering was too inconvenient to remember.
The parlor of Hartwell Manor became an improvised ward that afternoon. Blankets covered the carpet in neat rows. A fire roared in the hearth to chase away the February chill. Dr. Hayes worked methodically, his coat sleeves rolled to the elbows, while 2 orderlies fetched clean water and bandages from the kitchen. The 8 children lay still, eyes half closed against the unfamiliar brightness of lamps and windows. They flinched at every sudden sound, the clink of a spoon, the crackle of wood, a soldier's boot on the floorboards. Hayes's examination lasted into evening. He spoke his findings in a low voice to Captain Morrison, who stood nearby with arms folded, face carved from stone. Severe stunting. Some appear years younger than their probable ages. Rickets has bowed the legs on 4 of them. Spines curved from prolonged malnutrition. Skin infections, fungal patches, open sores that should have been treated months ago. Untreated fractures that healed crooked. Dental decay so advanced I can smell it from here. Respiratory issues, damp lungs, chronic coughs, and the psychological damage. He paused, glancing at the row of small bodies. Mutism in 5, catatonia in 2. They startle at nothing and everything. They expect orders for basic functions, eating, moving, even blinking. Freedom frightens them more than captivity ever did. Morrison listened without interrupting. When Hayes finished, the captain stepped outside to the porch, lit a cigar with shaking hands, and stared at the darkening river valley. He had seen battlefield amputations, cholera tents, children orphaned by raids. This was different. This had been deliberate, engineered. The military investigation began the next day. Morrison assigned guards to the property. Every document in the study, ledgers, letters, journals, was collected and sealed. The underground chambers were photographed with crude wet plate cameras, measurements taken, and the 2 decomposing bodies removed for burial in unmarked graves far from the house. Dr. Hayes submitted his report on February 21st, 23 pages of clinical horror, ending with a single underlined sentence. This was not an accident of war or neglect. This was systematic cruelty under the guise of science. Justice demands pursuit of the perpetrator. The report traveled up the chain. Brigade headquarters in Nashville, then Department Command. At each level, officers read it in private offices, faces paling, then set it aside with the same quiet calculation. The victims were formerly enslaved children, legally property under Tennessee law even after emancipation proclamations began to ripple south. Prosecuting a white Confederate sympathizer for crimes against his own assets had no clear precedent. Edmund Harwell had fled. Pursuing him would require resources the Army could not spare while fighting for Tennessee itself. Worse, public revelation risked inflaming local resentment, turning a monster into a martyr in the eyes of secessionist sympathizers. The Union needed cooperation from the countryside, not fresh outrage. By early March, the decision came down quietly. The detailed files, Hayes's report, witness statements, journal excerpts, was sealed and classified. Officers involved received verbal orders, discussed nothing publicly. The official record noted only irregularities in the management of enslaved persons at a Davidson County property. No trial, no wanted notices, no mention in dispatches. The 8 survivors were transported to a contraband camp near Nashville. Tents and rough barracks for thousands fleeing slavery into Union lines. There they joined the tide of displaced humanity, families separated, children orphaned, names misspelled or forgotten in hurried ledgers. Dr. Hayes visited twice, bringing broth and blankets, but the camp surgeon soon took over. The children's stories blurred into the larger chaos of war. No one pressed for testimony. Their mutism and terror made them unreliable witnesses anyway. Morrison returned to his company. He never spoke of the Harwell estate again, though the memory followed him through Shiloh, Chickamauga, Atlanta.
Years later, in a letter to his wife that was never sent, he wrote one line, "I opened a door in hell and closed it behind me." The chambers were left as they were, hatch bolted, darkness resealed. The manor stood empty until spring, when new soldiers moved in, unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Justice, like the children themselves, was quietly archived and forgotten. The war rolled on without pause. Hartwell Manor served as a Union hospital through the spring of 1865, its wide rooms filled with bandaged men and the smell of carbolic soap. When peace came, the property was seized, auctioned, and passed through hands that knew nothing of what lay beneath the smokehouse. The underground chambers remained sealed, hatch bolted, passages dark, until the late 1880s, when a new owner, disturbed by old rumors or perhaps by strange echoes on quiet nights, hired laborers to collapse the space. They dynamited the access shafts, dumped rubble into the voids, and filled the site with earth until no trace remained on the surface. The manor itself burned in 1879, arson suspected though never proven. Locals whispered that someone wanted the place cleansed by fire. The land changed slowly, then quickly. Tobacco gave way to subdivision. Fields became roads, then neighborhoods. By the early 20th century, the estate was swallowed by Nashville's southeastern sprawl. A shopping center rose where the main house once stood. Parking lots covered the old lawn. A residential subdivision called Meadowbrook spread across the former fields. Today, concrete and glass occupy the ground that once hid horror. Thousands pass daily. Shoppers pushing carts, office workers in cars, children on bicycles, unaware that beneath asphalt and foundations lie collapsed stone chambers, silent witnesses to a crime time refused to remember. Fragmentary evidence survived, but only just. In 1934, a historian named Robert Kimmel, researching contraband camps, stumbled across a partial copy of Dr. Hayes's 1862 medical report, misfiled in a Nashville archive. The surviving pages described skeletal children, rickets, mutism, and a system of deliberate cruelty that defied comprehension. Kimmel spent years chasing leads, marginal notes in military correspondence, a chaplain's diary mentioning children rescued from cave imprisonment, veteran interviews from the 1890s that trailed into vague discomfort. He wrote a 20-page paper titled An Undocumented Atrocity, the Hartwell Plantation Incident of 1862. 3 journals rejected it as insufficiently sourced or sensational. It appeared finally in an obscure regional quarterly in 1937. Almost no one read it. Kimmel died in 1941. The report he found vanished again during an archive reorganization in the 1950s. No historical marker stands at the site. No plaque names the 12 children: Marcus, Ada, Benjamin, Sarah, Joseph, Ruth, Thomas, and the others whose true names were never recorded. No memorial remembers the 4 who died underground or the 2 who slipped away after abandonment. The 8 who survived disappeared into contraband camp ledgers, then into the chaos of reconstruction. Perhaps some found families, rebuilt lives scarred by darkness. Perhaps others carried the silence to early graves. We do not know. Edmund Harwell vanished too. Confederate records hint at a clerk in Atlanta in 1862, a typhoid death in Richmond in 1863, a broken man in South Carolina who took his own life in 1864. None can be confirmed. He escaped justice as thoroughly as he escaped the manor. The story survives in fragments, partial reports, whispered veteran accounts, a single rejected academic paper. It exists in the uncomfortable space between documented fact and deliberate erasure. Federal authorities buried it in 1862 because it was politically inconvenient. Time finished the work. Somewhere beneath a parking lot in Davidson County, the stones that witnessed unimaginable suffering still lie, buried under layers of concrete, commerce, and ordinary American life. They remember nothing. But the children who suffered there deserve to be remembered, not as statistics or shadows, but as names, as voices, as human beings who endured darkness so profound that some never truly left it behind.
12 children entered that darkness in February 1856. 8 emerged in February 1862. None were ever truly freed.